he was a sinister figure. And the fact that he was fairly quiet and calm made him even more sinister. There was something devious about him. People wondered whether the young Bevan von Einem, who ended up a member of the family that killed a series of young men, whether he, in an early expression of his deviance, had abducted children. I'm Andrew Rule. This is Life and Crimes. A few weeks ago in early December, a prisoner died in a South Australian jail, and not before time. His name was Bevan Spencer von Einem. He was 79 years old, and no one, I suspect, mourns his passing, although he does, I believe, have one old friend in Adelaide, a man who runs an antique shop, and it is said that that man and Bevan von Einem were long-time associates, or even something closer, and it's possible that that man knows things about Bevan von Einem that he also will take to the grave. Bevan von Einem died after spending more than half his life behind bars. He was arrested in late 1983 over the murder of a teenager called Richard Kelvin. Richard Kelvin was 15 years old. He was the son of prominent South Australian newsreader Rob Kelvin, and therefore was, because of who his father was, quite well known. And his disappearance earlier in 1983 meant that his case became quite notorious. It was sort of almost a celebrity abduction. Young Richard Kelvin, 15, had been kicking a football around in the park near his house in a well-heeled suburb of Adelaide, and he was walking home for dinner at 6 o'clock in the evening, 6:30. It was just on twilight. It was dinner time. Going home for dinner, and he vanished. He didn't arrive home. His parents went out to look for him. He was gone. His best mate that he had been kicking the football with didn't know where he was. It turns out that he had been abducted only a few metres, really, around the corner from his family's house. Now, no one knew what happened to him for weeks. And many weeks later, his body was found in the Adelaide Hills. And his body showed signs of some terrible abuse. Clearly, he'd been held captive for something like 5 weeks. He'd been held captive long enough that his abductor, or abductors, plural, had actually got his hair cut, trimmed up, which was weird, but one of this coterie of sexual deviates that were responsible for this abduction was a hairdresser, a guy called Dennis St. Dennis, which is an unlikely name. He's now dead, so we can mention his name. He was involved with Bevan von Einem and others. For Richard Kelvin, it was clear that he'd probably bled to death because of large objects that had been inserted into his body. There'd been some signs of crude surgery, and it was clear that he'd suffered massive blood loss, massive abuse there. When the police forensics tested his blood and body tissue, they found signs of several hypnotic drugs, things like mandrax and other drugs that had been used, as well as alcohol. So clearly he had been drugged and was kept probably in a state of semi-consciousness, or at least drugged or sedated for most of the 5 weeks that he was held and sexually abused. Now, this was a shocking case, obviously. The police had a pretty good idea where to start looking because they were already very interested in Bevan von Einem, who was a suburban bookkeeper. He worked in a small factory in Adelaide as a bookkeeper. He'd always worked there as a bookkeeper. He was in his late 30s by this stage. He lived at home with his mother, who was, I think, divorced from his father. He was the youngest by far of 4 siblings, and so he was the classic sort of late lamb, the 4th child, of this woman, and he'd stayed home with mum and lived a very strange life. He was a quite mild-mannered man. He was tall, he was quite big, but he was in no way physical or threatening, but he was a very sinister person. And in fact, if you were trying to cast a film about what happened in Adelaide in that era of what we call the family killings, it would be hard to get an actor to play Bevan von Einem to be more subtly sinister than the man was himself. He was a sinister figure. And the fact that he was fairly quiet and calm made him even more sinister. There was something devious about him. The police were convinced that Bevan von Einem was one of a close circle of sexual deviants, that this Dennis St. Dennis, the hairdresser, was one, that this antique dealer, who we will not name here, was another, that there were at least 2 doctors who were involved, one of them now dead. Both those doctors were charged with very serious crimes at some point, one of them with murder. They were acquitted of those crimes. They were separate crimes, separate things, but they were all members of this loose group of deviants who were suspected widely of abducting hitchhikers or young men off the streets, giving them spiked drinks to sort of knock them out or sedate them, and then taking them to premises, perhaps a caravan. They think that they had a caravan somewhere that was used, and they would there sexually abuse them. Now, it would appear that Richard Kelvin was probably the 5th victim of this circle, and this circle of deviants was called by the police the family. And this is not to be confused with the religious cult that was established in the Dandenongs near Melbourne at some point around that time. Nothing to do with that at all. The family was this loose group of deviants, some of whom were capable of abduction and murder. Others were capable of sexual assaults on the victims. And clearly there were quite a few people who knew about it because they were friendly with the guys doing it. So there might have only been, 2 or 3 or 4 people involved in killings, but there might have been 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 that knew about it because they were friends. A very awful thing. The police had already spoken to Bevan von Einem about other disappearances. They had him on their radar. So when Richard Kelvin, when his body's found, they go to Bevan von Einem and they go to the house that he shared with his mother. I think she might have been an old woman and quite deaf, and it was possible that he was able to do things there without her knowing. And they were able to find certain hairs on the carpet or something that matched up with Kelvin's body, and find other forensic evidence to show that young Kelvin had been at some point in that 5 weeks at von Einem's house. Regardless of where else they'd taken him, he had been there. And the police were able to build a sufficiently strong forensic case to arrest Bevan von Einem and charge him with murder and actually gain a conviction. And so he went to jail in 1984 for a long sentence, which later I think the prosecution appealed and said it was not severe enough, and that he was, instead of getting 22 years, he got more, a lot more, and ultimately he got life with no remission. And so it was that he deservedly was locked up in South Australia for the rest of his natural life. Meanwhile, of course, the police were fascinated with the idea that they could arrest more people who were associated with von Einem. And they did try. They did question a couple of his associates over 4 earlier murders. Now, these earlier murders had started in 1979. The first known murder victim of this group we are calling the family was one Alan Arthur Barnes. Now, he may not have literally been the first victim, but this is the ones that ended up dead that we know about. Alan Arthur Barnes was 16 when he was picked up, I think, hitchhiking and murdered in mid-1979. His body was not found until, days after his disappearance. Then Neil Frederick Muir, 25 years old, was killed 2 months later. His remains were thrown into a river, and somebody saw this bag on the edge of the river where it had sort of washed up, and they looked and saw a human foot or whatever it was, realised it was a human. It was opened and it was found that Neil Muir's body had been dissected, cut up like a sheep or a bullock, and all sort of folded together. He'd been gutted like a fish. I think his head had been removed. It had all been folded up together, and it was a terrible sight. The fascinating thing for the police and prosecutors was that it seemed that he'd been very neatly cut up by someone who understood how to dissect a body, someone who might have had medical training, for instance. Whether that's true or not is hard to know. Whether it was someone with medical training, we can't be sure. But remember, there were at least 2 doctors involved with von Einem's group. 2 years later, 2-year gap, a schoolboy called Peter Stogneff, only 14 years old, he vanished in August of 1981. His remains were found in 1982, many months after his disappearance. Can you imagine the anguish of his parents, knowing that their 14-year-old boy has vanished, knowing that 2 other young males have been abducted and murdered? When his body was found, it too had been cut up like Neil Muir's. It had been dissected. This was a horrifying thing. Then in February 1982, the year before Richard Kelvin was abducted and murdered, an 18-year-old youth called Mark Andrew Langley was abducted and murdered. Now, police had spoken to Bevan von Einem about 2 of those cases. Doesn't matter which 2 really, but they had spoken to him about 2 of them. They were well aware of von Einem. He was well known around the gay beats of Adelaide, where he'd been known since the early 70s, and that it was known by police that he hung around with people who had very strange tastes in sex and other things, and drug use. Von Einem denied any guilt. He denied any knowledge of the other 4 murders, that is of Barnes, Muir, Stogneff and Langley. He said he knew nothing about it. But he also denied having anything to do with the murder of Richard Kelvin, which is the one he was convicted of on very clear and unambiguous evidence. What we don't know about Bevan von Einem is whether he was the sort of person who, at the age of 19 or 20, almost 20, back in the 60s, in the mid-60s, whether he could have been involved in abducting the Beaumont children. Now, this is the great unknown, and his death means that we will never know what actually happened to the Beaumont children if he had anything to do with it. The Beaumont children is probably the greatest unsolved cold case in Australian criminal history. It is one of the greatest unsolved cold cases in the English-speaking world ever, without doubt. And just to remind people what it was, on Australia Day 1966, that is 60 years ago, this month, 3 children from one family, Jane, Anna and Grant Beaumont. Now, Jane was 9, I think Anna was 7, and little Grant, the baby of the family, was only 4. Back in those innocent days, children of that age with, a big sister with them, a 9-year-old, a responsible girl, were allowed by their parents to go to the beach. It was a very hot January. Adelaide's a very hot city. Very hot January. The day before Australia Day, the 25th of January, their father, Jim Beaumont, I think a returned serviceman, he was a travelling salesman. He dropped the kids at Glenelg Beach, which is only, a kilometre and a half or something from there, from where they lived, almost walking distance. He dropped them off at the beach with, a sandwich or something and some loose change so they could buy a bus ticket to get back home, which was pretty easy to do. And indeed, at lunchtime, as arranged, they got on the bus and they went home to Mum, Nancy Beaumont. And, nice day at the beach and all good. And she said, if it's hot tomorrow, you can go again. And this time, Jane, you can take the two little ones on the bus there and on the bus home. So next day, Australia Day, they go to the bus stop at, 9 o'clock or whatever, and they catch the bus down to Glenelg Beach. And it's been a success the day before and should be again. They're expected home on the midday bus. Now, the bus is only a 5-minute trip. So the midday bus at Glenelg would get home to Somerton Park where they lived at 12:05 or something like that. They weren't on the bus. Mrs. Beaumont, of course, there's no mobile phones, there's no way of checking anything much. She thinks, well, they've missed the bus. They'll be on the next one at 2 o'clock. They weren't on the next one at 2 o'clock. Then she raises the alarm. Her husband, Jim, he turns up. He's been away on a country trip and he's as a travelling salesman. He turns up in the afternoon. He's home early and they start looking for the children. They can't find them. They call the police. Sadly, the police and the police artist have all been on the booze at a barbecue because it's Australia Day. And the police artist were very, very drunk, which is sad. And it explains why, if you look up this case in newspapers of the period, you will see an artist's impression of the man that witnesses saw with the children. Witnesses saw a man with the children at the beach. The police artist has drawn this man and he looks like an alien. He does look like something from outer space. His distinguishing features are, I think, light-coloured hair and high cheekbones and a sort of a thin face. This is done by a drunk artist with the benefit of talking to witnesses who notoriously never know what they've seen, whether someone's tall or short or whatever. So the police issued art of the suspected abductor is next to useless, probably, and that's why. There is no sign of the children. The police, the day after Australia Day, they're sober and they get a wriggle on because they just hope the kids are going to turn up, because sometimes kids go missing for a while and turn up. Often kids go missing for a while and turn up. Mostly they turn up, but they didn't turn up. And because they're so young, it doesn't look good. And because Jane, the oldest girl, 9 years old, very sensible girl, the parents know that something very bad has happened. They hope it hasn't, but they sort of know it has. The police talk to everybody they can. They find several witnesses who describe a young, but do we mean someone in their 20s, someone in their 30s? No one's really sure now. When they say a young, tall, suntanned man, I think blonde, some say blonde, was seen playing with the kids. There is more evidence of such an association because Jane, who'd been given a few shillings, coins, to buy some food and buy their bus ticket home, she had gone to the canteen or shop at the beach or nearby the beach with a £1 note. Now, a £1 note was quite a significant amount of money in 1966. Probably like a kid having a $50 note now. It's not something, or even a $100 note, a large denomination for a small child to have. I can remember myself being given a £1 note for Christmas or a birthday in around that era and being sort of blown away with the quantity. I have a £1 note. And it wasn't sort of like having 2 shillings that you would spend on ice cream. It was a significant amount of money. So the fact that she'd been given that to buy some food meant that an adult stranger had given it to her. That was a very sinister thing. The Beaumonts disappeared forever. No one found one trace of the Beaumonts. The police had no more idea 10 years later, 20 years later, 50 years later, or today than they had in that first week. Well-meaning people and charlatans and clairvoyants and all sorts of people and interstate detectives, they've all had a go at trying to solve the Beaumont case. We've talked about it, obviously, in the podcast. There are some interesting suspects for it and, quite good suspects for it in many ways. But Bevan von Einem almost fits the bill. He fits the bill in this sense. He's clearly a mild-mannered sexual deviant. In that time, 1966, he was almost 20, old enough to be in the grip of whatever sort of sexual aberrations that took hold of him. He was old enough and big enough and ugly enough to do bad things. He had the mental capacity and the physical capacity to do bad things. We know that. It would appear that he was probably at Glenelg Beach that day. A lot of people were. If you're in Adelaide and it was a hot day, on an Australia Day you would tend to go there. And it seems that a camera crew shooting news footage at Glenelg Beach did accidentally get in a shot of the camera sweeping around looking at the crowd, a shot of a young man who looked very much like a young Bevan von Einem. And so it was always thought, it was always wondered, people wondered whether the young Bevan von Einem, who ended up a member of the family that killed a series of young men, whether he, in an early expression of his deviance, had abducted children. Now, some experts would say, well, that's unlikely because his subsequent aberrant behaviour involved young males, teenagers and older. That's true. But maybe he was feeling his way. Maybe he wasn't up to abducting young males alone when he was 19 years old, and he was up for abducting children that were small and easy to grab. We will never know the truth about the Beaumonts and Bevan von Einem. There is a current and recurring story that it might have been a local millionaire or businessman, a wealthy businessman, called Harry Phipps. That story's done the rounds twice in the last 15 years, I think. In fact, the person promoting that story, and they might be right, is issuing a book on the 60th anniversary of the Beaumonts' disappearance, pushing the theory that Harry Phipps fits the bill as the Beaumont abductor because he lived nearby, he was plausible, he was friendly. Children might well have trusted him, and according to one of his own adult children, he was a pedophile. Others say no, his adult son who accused him of being a pedophile was motivated by jealousy and greed and revenge because he'd been cut out of his father's will. And so he accused him of being a pedophile later just to get revenge on the family. It's all a big mystery, but if Bevan von Einem was anything to do with it, it's now too late to have any chance of finding out. Bevan von Einem died early in December, just before Christmas. Jim Beaumont, the Beaumont children's father, died at a massive age, 97 I think he was, just 2 or 3 years ago. And his ex-wife, Nancy Beaumont, in the end they split up under the pressure of the whole grief of it. She died in her mid-90s, a little bit before that. And so both parents are gone and Bevan von Einem's gone. And really, on the 60th anniversary of the Beaumont children case, we probably can rule a line under it forever. Nothing now is ever going to be discovered because those who could have been involved are almost certainly dead, and it's highly unlikely that anyone is going to come forward or have any fresh evidence at this point. So this leads us around to what sort of person was Bevan von Einem? Well, whether or not he had anything to do with the Beaumonts, he certainly had a lot to do with the family killings. So let's look at Bevan von Einem in several ways. One is the witnesses at the Glenelg Beach said that they saw a tall, slim, suntanned man, some of them said with blonde hair. Now, the interesting thing is that von Einem, in later pictures that we saw of him, when he was first arrested in his 30s, he had jet black hair. But he had jet black hair because it was dyed jet black by his friend, the friendly hairdresser, Dennis St. Dennis. And it was dyed jet black, not because he was a goth, but because it appears that he had had some car accident as a teenager. This is Bevan von Einem, which turned all his hair prematurely grey. So at the age of 19, 18, whatever, he's walking around with a head of grey hair. Now, when you see someone that age with a head of grey hair, it actually looks ash blonde. They don't look old, they just look like an ash blonde as you see in, Scandinavia or Finland or wherever and other places. And it could easily be that if you saw a 19-year-old with a suntan with hair that colour, he's blonde, just a really pale blonde. One of my own kids had hair like that when he was young. It's just one of those things. And it does tally in that sense. It does make sense that it could fit the description. The other thing about Bevan von Einem, he had quite a pronounced lower jaw. He had a strong lower jaw and he had a bit of a bulbous nose. He was a slightly unprepossessing man. He was quiet. He kept to himself. When he was arrested by the police after the discovery of Richard Kelvin's body, as I say, he had the jet black hair. He used to wear dark sunglasses, like sort of Roy Orbison or somebody. And he looked like what he was, a suburban bookkeeper, a sort of an accountant from the suburbs. He drove a Falcon sedan. He had, by that stage in his 30s, he had a bit of a pot belly. He wore, conventional slacks and conventional shirts and that sort of stuff because he dressed like a bookkeeper. But at night he did run around with a very strange crew. And that crew, while we're not suggesting, as some do, that, they were really well connected, that there was a judge and a QC and a politician and all those rumours of people in high places, there was that suggestion that they were people who were sort of well-heeled middle-class people of middling to high intelligence, the two doctors, von Einem, the bookkeeper, and possibly a lawyer, a criminal lawyer called Terence Stevenson, who was a flamboyant criminal lawyer who was well known in those circles, of the von Einem circles, who himself was subsequently murdered. His body was found in a freezer in very strange circumstances, and his sometime lover, a young man, was arrested and convicted of Terence Stevenson's murder. A conviction that has been roundly criticised ever since because it seemed to be gained in court with evidence that doesn't really stand up. So it's possible that this circle of bad deviants that did terrible things could have involved this lawyer, Terence Stevenson. So we can see why the legend of the family murders in Adelaide has grown, because people who gossip with other people and spread rumours, and somebody's brother-in-law knows a policeman who, knows another policewoman and all that stuff. The legend of the highly placed circle of people has grown and grown in Adelaide. This would lead some to speculate that these people, having seen von Einem go inside, that he was sort of the sacrificial lamb, that von Einem kept his mouth shut all those years through maybe a twisted sense of loyalty. Maybe there was the unspoken threat for years that if you talk, something bad will happen to your mother. But of course his mother died in the early 2000s. Her name was Thora von Einem. She was a pianist, which is a strange occupation in a sense. She's described in various stories as a pianist. Now, whether she was a professional pianist, I don't know, but you'd suspect she must have been someone who wasn't just a hobbyist, who had a piano at home in the parlour. Thora, I understand, sort of stood by her son and all that, and it was felt that he would not admit anything or make any confessions while she was alive. But when she died in the early 2000s, about 21 years ago now, something like that, he didn't put his hand up and say, well, now I'll tell you everything, now Mum's dead. He didn't change. He didn't add anything. If he knew any secrets about other people, he wasn't about to divulge them. Some suggest that he was still close to at least one of the other conspirators. Some suggest it was his sometime lover, the antique dealer, that kept him loyal and that he didn't want to say anything to involve him or others. Regardless of the reason, the fact is he never said a word about the family murders or about the Beaumont children, which may not have been him anyway. And he only came to official notice 2 or 3 times. He was briefly the subject of some stories when he was found with, I think, drawings of children or something in his cell. I think prison officers are an interesting lot. Some are really good and some are not so good. I think prison officers were getting him to von Einem to paint Christmas cards or something. He was quite a handy prison artist, in that sort of tattoo way that prisoners develop. And that they were selling these because of his notoriety. They were able to sell these cards out in the world. And there was a bit of a scandal about that at one point. But essentially, nothing changed. And when he got lung cancer, as he did, I think a year or so ago, doesn't matter, in relatively recent times, there was no sympathy for him from anyone, naturally. And in late November, I think he was moved from where he had been locked up at Yatala to a prison hospital where he died on December the 6th, totally unmourned, one would think. The authorities decided to incinerate his body, to cremate him, in fact, and they have handed over his ashes to those few remaining family members who would be able to decide what to do with them, which is not the greatest thing to have given to you, probably, is your Uncle Bevan's ashes. The Uncle Bevan, the sex killer, here's his ashes. His 3 older siblings, to my understanding, have all died of old age before he did. And so the only people left in the world related to Bevan von Einem, I think, would be his nieces and nephews, who probably, I think, keep it on the lowdown that they're related to him. It's a very unfortunate surname to have in South Australia because it's very rare, and one imagines that most von Einems are somehow related in some way, and that they have all probably come from South Australia. And so there is the death, the passing of a man who brought tremendous shame on his own family and on, in fact, a city. And in closing, I'd like to quote Salman Rushdie, the great novelist who visited Adelaide for the Adelaide Writers' Festival in 1984. And he wrote, in a subsequent piece he wrote about Adelaide, that it was a quiet, church-loving the city that reminded him of Salem or Amityville. He said it's one of those quiet, respectable places where the worst things go on. And he said it's the perfect setting for a Stephen King novel or a horror movie. And I think Salman Rushdie was right. On a personal note, I once went to Adelaide Probably 2007, around there. And I spent a couple of days there looking around, and I wanted to do the big definitive piece about the city of churches where bad things happened. And I visited the antique shop in the middle of the day, the antique shop where Bevan von Einem's great and good friend and co-conspirator, allegedly, ran his antique shop. And I went to the door, and it was, lunchtime on a normal day, sunny day. And I was amazed to find that the door was locked, and that to get into this guy's antique shop you had to ring the bell, and he would look at you and decide whether you were a danger to him, I think, and then would let you in. And I rang the bell, went in, pretended to look at some antique clocks or something, and went out again. Clearly that man didn't want to have people just stepping in off the street, because I think the suggestion was that at some point, if his door were unlocked, that one day someone he didn't want to see would step in there and do something very bad to him. And so he was always on his guard. And listeners, I understand he's still there and still on his guard. So if you're ever in Adelaide, stick your head in and have a look at an alleged monster, Bevan von Einem's only friend. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcasts@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcasts sold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.